I originally intended to talk to you about the encryption issue today, but given where this hearing started and where I think it's going as it relates to the issue of FISA abuse, I'm going to ask you about this. I want to give you an opportunity to hopefully answer these questions once and for all so that the rest of your testimony can be properly directed. It seems like some of my Democratic colleagues, because this FISA process was initiated during the Obama administration, that they want to focus on the fact that there was no abuse of the FISA process or that that abuse was not politically motivated. It started with Chairman Nadler. The very first question to you was trying to establish that the Inspector General found no evidence of political motive or bias against the president, and you responded that the Inspector General's report speaks for itself. So does the Inspector General. And Inspector General Horowitz on December 11th before the Senate Judiciary Committee said this, quote, "On the FISA side, we found, as you noted, a lack of documentary or testimonial evidence about intentionality, but we also noted the lack of satisfactory explanations and, in fact, leave open the possibility that for the reasons you indicated, it is unclear what the motivations were. On the one hand, gross incompetence, negligence. On the other hand, intentionality, and everywhere in between," end quote. Just because no FBI agent tells the Inspector General, "I admit I'm biased and politically motivated against President Trump," doesn't mean there isn't overwhelming evidence of bias and political motivation in the record. To use just one example, an FBI lawyer involved intimately in this FISA process against a Trump campaign associate, Carter Page, sent a number of texts in and around the election of President Trump. Here are a few of them. "The crazies finally won." Another one. "This is the Tea Party on steroids." Another one. "Pence is stupid." Another text that he sent. "I just can't imagine the systematic disassembly of the process, the progress we've made over the last 8 years. And finally, when asked whether he intended to keep working during the Trump administration, he said, quote, "Viva la resistance." Regardless of what that FBI lawyer admitted, do you see evidence of political bias or motivation against President Trump in those text messages?
Well, I would just say, Congressman, as I've said before, that I consider the report to have described conduct that I consider unacceptable and unrepresentative of who we are as an institution. I'm not going to comment on specific people's conduct for a variety of reasons, but I will say that political bias has no place in today's FBI.
Well, I appreciate that, but I'm going to ask you to comment on someone's specific conduct, because that very same FBI agent is the one the Inspector General found in his report was the one that tampered with evidence by counterfeiting an email from an intelligence agency to illegally continue surveillance of a Trump campaign associate. That's what happened, right, Director?
Again, I would just refer you to the report.
Well, the report acknowledges that. So does the Department of Justice and the FISA court. They acknowledge that this was illegal surveillance with respect to at least several of these FISA applications because there was not probable cause or proper predication, correct?
Right.
So, to the point of one of my Democratic colleagues that there was no fraud on the court, illegal surveillance and changing evidence to conduct illegal surveillance is the very definition of fraud on the court, is it not?
Well, I certainly think it describes conduct that's utterly unacceptable.
And it's what took place here.
Well, again, I refer to the report. We have accepted, I've been very clear about this, we've accepted every finding in the Inspector General's report, including some that are extremely painful to us as an institution.
And I appreciate it, Director Wray. I love the FBI. You know my background. I know what you're trying to do. I know the difficult position that you're in. I think the record is clear. I remain convinced that the prior administration weaponized the FBI for political motivation and purposes. I just wonder whether or not you're going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle. I truly know that your motivations are to do that. I wish you the best of luck. I yield back. Director, did you make the decision not to recommend criminal charges relating to classified information before or after Hillary Clinton was interviewed by the FBI on July the 2nd?
After.
Okay, then I'm going to need your help in trying to understand how that's possible. I think there's a lot of prosecutors or former prosecutors that are shaking our heads in how that could be the case, because if there was ever any real possibility that Hillary Clinton might be charged for something that she admitted to on July the 2nd, why would two of the central witnesses in a potential prosecution against her be allowed to sit in the same room to hear the testimony? Now, I've heard your earlier answers today. You said that, well, it was because the interview was voluntary and they were her lawyers. But I think you're skirting the real issue there, Director. First of all, the fact that it was voluntary, it didn't have to be, right? You could have impaneled an investigative grand jury. She could have been subpoenaed. And I know you've said that you can't comment on that, and I don't really care about the decision about whether or not there should have been a grand jury here. But since you didn't have one, it goes to the issue at hand about whether or not this interview should have ever taken place. With due respect to the answers that you've given, the FBI and the Department of Justice absolutely control whether or not an interview is going to take place with other witnesses in the room, because the simple truth is, if under the circumstances as you've described, those interviews never take place. If there was ever any possibility that something Hillary Clinton might have said on July 2nd could have possibly resulted in criminal charges that might possibly resulted in a trial against her relating to this classified information, well then, to use your words, Director, I don't think that there's any reasonable prosecutor out there who would have allowed two immunized witnesses central to the prosecution to proving the case against her to sit in the room with the interview, the FBI interview of the subject of that investigation. And if I heard you earlier today, in your long career, I heard you say that you've never had that circumstance. Did I hear you correctly?
That's correct. But
okay, and I never have either, and I've never met a prosecutor that's ever had that. So, to me, the only way that an interview takes place with the two central witnesses and the subject of the investigation is if the decision has already been made that all three people in that room are not going to be charged.
Okay, can I respond?
Yes, please.
I know in our political life sometimes people casually accuse each other of being dishonest, but if colleagues of ours believe I am lying about when I made this decision, please urge them to contact me privately so we can have a conversation about this. All I can do is tell you again, the decision was made after that because I didn't know what was going to happen in that interview. She maybe lied during the interview in a way we could prove. Let me finish. I would also urge you to tell me what tools we have as prosecutors and investigators to kick out of an interview someone that the subject says is their lawyer.
That's not my point. The interview never should have taken place if you were going to allow the central witnesses that you needed to prove the case to sit there and listen to the testimony that the subject was going to give. It never happens. It never happened to you, and it's never happened to me or any other prosecutor that I met. And I know you've defended the people that were involved in this as being great, but if it's never happened, I wonder why this is a case of first precedent with respect to that practice that you and I have never seen in our careers.
You and I don't control the universe of what's happened. I suspect it's very unusual. A key fact, though, that maybe is leading to some confusion here is we had already concluded we didn't have a prosecutable case against Heather Samuelson or Cheryl Mills at that point. If they were targets of our investigation, maybe we would have canceled the interview. But frankly, our focus was on the subject. The subject at that point was Hillary Clinton.
All right, let me move on. According to the FBI's own documents, Paul Gambetta was, in his first interview on February the 18th, told FBI agents that he had no knowledge about the preservation order for the Clinton emails, correct?
I don't know the dates of that, but I'm sure it's in the 302.
Okay, but then 2.5 months later, on May the 3rd, his second interview, he made a 180-degree turn. And he admitted that, in fact, he was aware of the preservation order, and he was aware of the fact that that meant that he shouldn't disturb the Clinton emails, correct?
Yep.
Okay, well then I need your help again here, because when I was at the Department of Justice, your reward for lying to federal agents was an 18 U.S.C. 1001 charge or potential obstruction of justice charge. It wasn't immunity.
Depends on where you're trying to go with the investigation. It's a low-level guy, and you're trying to move up in the chain, you might think about it differently.
Well, He lied to an FBI agent. You don't think that's important?
Oh, it's very important. Happens all the time. Unfortunately, it's very, very important. Sometimes you prosecute that person and end their cooperation. Sometimes you try and sign them up.
But if they lie to an FBI agent after they're given immunity, they violated the terms of their immunity agreement.
Oh, sure, after the agreement.
And so that's my point. He shouldn't have immunity anymore.
No, I'm sorry, I may have misunderstood you. He lied to us before he came clean under the immunity agreement and admitted that he had deleted the emails.
No, not according to the FBI's documents. He had the immunity agreement in December of 2015. These interviews took place in February and March and May of this year, 2016.
Combetta?
Combetta.
Okay, then I'm confused and misremembering, but I don't think that's right.
Okay, well, my time's expired, but I have one last question, and I think that's important. At this point, based on everything, do you think that any laws were broken by Hillary Clinton or her lawyers?
Do I think that any laws were broken?
Yeah.
I don't think there's evidence to establish that.
Okay. Well, I think you're making my point when you say there's no evidence to establish that. Maybe not in the way she handled classified information, but with respect to obstruction of justice. And you've got a pen here. I just want to make sure the record's clear about the evidence that you didn't have, that you can't use to prove. So this comes from the FBI's own report. It says that the FBI didn't have the Clintons' personal Apple server used for Hillary Clinton work emails. That was never located, so the FBI could never examine it. An Apple MacBook laptop and thumb drive that contained Hillary Clinton's email archives was lost, so the FBI never examined that. 2 BlackBerry devices, provided the FBI didn't have SIM cards or SD data cards. 13 Hillary Clinton personal mobile devices were lost, discarded, or destroyed with a hammer, so the FBI clearly didn't examine those. Various server backups were deleted over time, so the FBI didn't examine that. After the State Department and my colleague, Mr. Gowdy, here notified Ms. Clinton that her records would be sought by the Benghazi Committee, copies of her emails on the laptops of both of her lawyers, Cheryl Mills and Harold Mills, and Heather Samuelson, were wiped clean with bleach bits, so the FBI didn't review that. After those emails were subpoenaed, Hillary Clinton's email archive was also permanently deleted from the Platte River Network with bleach bit, so the FBI didn't review that. And also after the subpoena, backups of the Platte River server were manually deleted. Now, Director, hopefully that list is substantially accurate because it comes from your own documents. My question to you is this. Any one of those in that very, very long list, to me, says obstruction of justice. Collectively, they scream obstruction of justice. And to ignore them, I think, really allows not just reasonable prosecutors, but reasonable people to believe that maybe the decision on this was made a long time ago not to prosecute Hillary Clinton. And with that, I yield back.
Director, do you care to respond?
Very briefly, to ignore that which we don't have, we're in a fact-based world, so we make evaluations based on the evidence we're able to gather using the tools that we have. So it's hard for me to react to these things that you don't have. So that's my reaction to it.
Just Mr. Ratcliffe.
Thank you, Chairman. Inspector Horowitz, in your report and now in your testimony, you said that you are deeply troubled and very concerned that the anti-Trump bias reflected in the struck page text messages was so great as to have possibly impacted Peter Strzok's conduct in the Wiener laptop part of the Hillary Clinton investigation. Is that fair?
Correct.
So if the Department of Justice and the FBI's own Inspector General is very concerned and deeply troubled about Peter Strzok's anti-Trump bias affecting his actions as an FBI agent, is it unreasonable for President Trump, as the subject of an investigation, to likewise be very concerned and deeply troubled that Mr. Strzok was put in charge of the Trump-Russia investigation?
I'm going to step back on that, Congressman, and speak to the broader point that that's precisely why we were concerned, generally speaking, about the election review, that those kind of messages create that appearance of bias that undercuts credibility and the ability to do investigation. I can't speak to
right.
Russia.
Well, I'm not asking you to make any findings about the Trump-Russia matter. I'm asking you about the people that you investigated in your report, people whose actions you found so deeply troubling and very concerning. I just want to find out if you think it's unreasonable for the President to feel the same way you do.
My concern on that is, as you know, we're currently reviewing that, and I want to be careful. I don't want to be myself seen as prejudging any outcomes here. So I'm going to let folks draw what reasonable inferences they want to draw from this, but I don't want to be seen as making any judgments on that.
Well, do you think it's unreasonable for President Trump to be very concerned or deeply troubled, as you were, that 8 days after Peter Strzok was put in charge of the Trump-Russia investigation, that he promised another FBI employee, Lisa Page, that Trump would never be president because he'd stop it?
I think any individual in this country should be concerned about that kind of language.
And the reason you're concerned about that, Inspector General, I think, is because you've said numerous times here that Strzok's stated bias and stated willingness to act on that bias are antithetical to the core values of the FBI, correct? Another thing that's antithetical to the FBI and the Department of Justice and our entire justice system is putting people in charge of investigating people they hate, of people that they are biased against and that they are prejudiced against, right?
Correct.
And we don't do that in our justice system. We can't do that in our justice system, a system where the bedrock principle has to be the fair and impartial administration of justice, free from bias and prejudice, right?
Correct.
So I think the point that you're making, and that I agree with, is that anyone, you, me, any member of Congress, any American who becomes the subject of an investigation should not be investigated by people who have sent hundreds of hateful text messages about them before the investigation ever began, and then continued to send them while the investigation was occurring. That is by definition prejudicial to the fair and impartial administration of justice, isn't it?
I think that is precisely the concern.
And yet, that is exactly what happened to President Trump. Now, to your credit, Inspector Horwitz, you revealed the astonishing level, the outrageous level of bias and prejudice, and when you did, Special Counsel Mueller removed Peter Strzok from the case. But you and I are former prosecutors, and you and I both know that it is impossible to remove bias and prejudice from all of the actions taken, all of the decisions made, all of the investigative plans implemented, all of the evidence gathered by Peter Strzok and at least 2 other Trump-hating FBI agents and lawyers who were assigned to the investigation. That's pretty hard to do, isn't it?
Well, that is precisely the question, as you know, we're looking at.
So my colleagues over there just keep pointing out that your report doesn't state any conclusions about the Trump-Russia investigation. And they're right. The report doesn't state any conclusions. But your findings of fact about the people in charge of the Trump-Russia investigation, in the case of Peter Strzok, for 9 months, the person in charge of the investigation, well, that leads to all sorts of undeniable conclusions about pervasive bias and prejudice against President Trump by the people who never, ever should have been in charge of gathering evidence against him. Let me switch topics in the remaining 20 seconds that I have. Did Jim Comey make the decision not to prosecute Hillary Clinton before or after her July 2nd, 2016 interview?
I'm going to let you answer the question, even though the gentleman from Texas grossly misjudged the amount of time he does not have left anymore. It's actually 20 seconds over rather than under, but you can answer the question.
As we laid out here and described here, prior to the July 2nd interview, absent, as we were told, either a confession or a false statements, the decision had been made to close the investigation.
So the fact that Director Comey testified under oath to members of Congress in response to a question about whether or not the decision was made before or after, unequivocally stated after, do you think it's reasonable for members of Congress to think that they were misled by that answer?
I'd probably have to look at the transcript. As you know, so much of that turns on the precise question and answer. So
can I take that as a promise to look at that?
I'll take a look at the question and answer, and then we can talk further, Congressman, about that.
Thank you, Inspector Horwitz. Appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields.
I thank Dr. Gerwa and Ms. Liscam are witnesses for being here today. During the rise of the opioid crisis, amidst the many lives lost in its wake, law enforcement found that the challenge to cracking down on the supply of synthetic opioids like fentanyl analogs was that drug traffickers could sell a slightly changed substance that did not fall under the existing schedule of the Controlled Substances Act. In February of 2018, the Drug Enforcement Administration, under President Trump's watch, used its authority to ban all fentanyl substances by placing them into Schedule I of the Controlled Substances Act. By that decision, criminals would now face the consequences of the destruction they have left throughout our country. However, under existing law, the Drug Enforcement Administration is only allowed to use its emergency regulatory powers to ban all fentanyl substances for 2 years. After that, it could be extended for at most 1 year after consultation with the Department of Health and Human Services. You would think that the least this Congress could do is to extend the scheduling of fentanyl under the Controlled Substances Act indefinitely. A proposed bill, the Stopping Overdoses of Fentanyl Analogs Act, is supported by attorneys general in all 50 states. This isn't a conservative issue, it's not a liberal issue, it's not a rural issue or an urban issue. If the Attorney General of Texas and the Attorney General of California can find common ground on this issue, the very least we could do is act on this issue. But instead, we are racing toward an expiration of the ban on fentanyl analogs simply because Congress is unwilling to act. This is entirely preventable. Congress had a chance during the last year's appropriations debate to include a measure empowering the DEA to keep the ban on fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances indefinitely. It failed. According to a Washington Post editorial, it appears that the reluctance with giving the DEA this essential authority may be due to the concerns of some in Congress about sentencing guidelines. I think the reason we haven't heard any public opposition from members about this is that, quite frankly, it's hard to publicly stand up and oppose extending the scheduling of fentanyl analogs. It's crazy to think that the reason we're in this position is that some in Congress are concerned that convicted drug traffickers would spend a little extra time in jail. A concern about the amount of time drug traffickers spend behind bars is a difficult explanation to give to the families of people who have died from drug overdoses. But yet here we are. Next week, the scheduling of fentanyl analogs expires. I urge my colleagues to put partisan politics aside and put the needs of our constituents and the American people first. Some may think that a public health approach is the best way to solve the opioid crisis. Some think that providing law enforcement with the tools to hold suppliers and traffickers accountable is the best way to solve this issue. But doing nothing, waiting until 1 week before the deadline to do something, is not the answer. The failure to act is a disservice to our communities. It's a disservice to our constituents. It's a disservice to the families of the victims who have lost their lives. I yield back.
Mr. Ratcliffe is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. As you well know, over my time as the chairman of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Subcommittee, the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program, or CDM, has been one of DHS's top priorities because it has the potential to dramatically increase our visibility across federal networks. Many of us believe the program has the ability to provide the information necessary to make better decisions, not only to combat our enemies in cyberspace, but also to help federal CIOs manage information technology. This bill, H.R. 6443, will codify the CDM program at DHS to ensure that NPPD will have the necessary authorities to offer those essential cybersecurity tools and capabilities to our civilian agencies. Our goal in bringing this legislation is to boost the long-term success of the CDM program by ensuring that it keeps pace with the cutting-edge technologies and capabilities being developed in the private sector, and to avoid being locked into technology that will soon become outdated or unsupported by vendors, a complaint that many of us have heard far too often. The security data that CDM capabilities and tools collect will help federal CIOs and DHS to make smarter choices about where taxpayer dollars are going and to better understand some of the most basic questions every cybersecurity official faces, including the most basic question: what are the devices on our network? There may be no better argument for H.R. 6443 and the CDM program than the findings and recommendations of OMB and DHS's Federal Cybersecurity Risk Determination that was released just last month. OMB found that almost 75% of federal agencies are vulnerable to cyber threats, in large part due to their inability to understand cyber risks and therefore their inability to prioritize their resources. DHS's CDM program is the best solution to that problem. It's the best way to help federal agencies and the whole of the federal government to understand the threats they face and the risks that vulnerabilities pose in real time. Codifying the CDM program will further DHS's role in the cybersecurity mission throughout the government and give the newly confirmed Undersecretary of NPPD, Chris Krebs, the kind of ammunition that he needs to keep growing this vitally important program. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman,
The Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting this morning to receive testimony regarding how the federal government understands and manages enterprise-wide cybersecurity risks. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. As we convene today, this subcommittee is concerned that the federal government is not yet equipped to determine how threat actors seek to gain access to our private information. This challenge is one of the reasons I introduced, and yesterday the full committee passed, the Advancing Cybersecurity Diagnostics and Mitigation Act. H.R. 6443 will codify and provide direction to DHS regarding the CDM program. This was a bipartisan effort, and I thank the ranking member, Mr. Richmond, as well as Mr. Katko, Mr. Donovan, Mr. Fitzpatrick, and Mr. Langevin for working with me on this important issue, because there is an evident lack of strategy in mitigating risk across our federal agencies. Cyber workforce gaps and legacy IT systems are vulnerabilities in the federal government's cybersecurity posture, but the efficacy of our basic cybersecurity practices remain common liabilities. To this end, the Office of Management and Budget and Department of Homeland Security released a report earlier this year entitled Federal Cybersecurity Risk Determination Report Action Plan. This report spoke to many of the challenges faced in securing enterprise-wide federal government IT systems. Perhaps not surprisingly, OMB and DHS determined that 74% of government agencies have cybersecurity programs that are either at risk or at high risk. The risk assessments performed by these agencies showed that a lack of threat information results in ineffective allocations of limited cyber resources. This overall situation creates enterprise-wide gaps in our network visibility, IT tool and capability standardization, and common operating procedures, all of which negatively impact federal cybersecurity. Given the significant and ever-increasing danger of threats and the absence of good data inventory, risk management must be fully integrated into every aspect of an organization. Leaders of federal agencies at all organizational levels must understand their responsibilities, and they must be accountable for protecting organizational assets and managing security and privacy risks. The OMB and DHS report identified 4 main actions that are necessary to address cybersecurity risks across the federal enterprise. First, Federal agencies must increase their cybersecurity threat awareness. This seems like a too obvious of a recommendation, but often those charged with defending agency networks lack timely information regarding the tactics, techniques, and procedures that our adversaries are using to exploit government information systems. Second, OMB urged agencies to standardize IT and cybersecurity capabilities to control costs and to improve asset management. Generally speaking, agencies do not have standardized cybersecurity processes, which ultimately impacts their ability to efficiently and effectively combat cyber threats. The Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program, or CDM, will accelerate both IT management efforts and cybersecurity improvements across the federal government. In fact, my bill, the Advancing Cybersecurity Diagnostics and Mitigation Act, will require the program to evolve, thereby ensuring that agency CIOs and DHS have the visibility necessary not only to combat threats, but also to target modernization resources and efforts where they are most needed. The third recommended action is that agencies must consolidate their security operations centers to improve incident detection and response capabilities. OMB found that only 27% of agencies can detect and investigate attempts to access large volumes of data. This troubling statistic should cause us all to pause. While the report identifies that federal agencies currently lack network visibility, DHS's CDM program can assist with this issue by providing insight into what is occurring on networks. After all, you can't defend what you can't see. And finally, OMB recommended that agencies increase accountability through improved governance processes. Indeed, both the Federal Information Security Management Act and President Trump's executive order on strengthening the cybersecurity and federal networks and critical infrastructure already identify the agency head as the official ultimately responsible for each agency's cybersecurity. Of course, agency heads often delegate cyber risk management responsibilities to the Chief Information Officer and Chief Information Security Officer, but agency leadership should increase its oversight of and its engagement in their agency's cybersecurity ecosystem. Ultimately, a collaborative approach to mitigating cyber threats is meant to prioritize meeting the needs of DHS's partners and is consistent with the growing recognition among government, academic, and corporate leaders that cybersecurity is increasingly interdependent across sectors and must be a core aspect of risk management strategies. We are in an era that requires flexibility, resiliency, and discipline. And I look forward to a candid conversation with our witnesses today about ensuring our federal networks can embody these goals. Your thoughts and opinions are important as we oversee the state of federal government cybersecurity risks.
Time. Thank you.
I now recognize Mr. Cloud from Texas for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Chair, for continuing this investigation. So important to where we need to go in the future. You know, Director Ratcliffe, I promoted you maybe in one way, but you mentioned some of the stuff coming up with that China did to cover up a lot of what happened. We know they hoarded PPP, they silenced dissenters, they blocked investigations into the Wuhan lab. They've, as you mentioned, blamed service members. They've destroyed data, and so where we don't have maybe evidence of the definitive evidence of the origin, it certainly seems like we have evidence of a cover-up. Now, you know, I'm aggrieved by that, but I'm not surprised that godless communist countries do bad things. What has been extremely concerning and surprising, I think, to a lot of Americans is to see how certain aspects of our government has, in a way, misled them through the last few years. And you've mentioned that you have pretty high confidence that this did not have natural origins. Now we have the Department of Energy and the FBI now say that the lab leak is the most likely scenario as well, which, you know, you mentioned all the apparatuses at our intelligence world-class, world-leading tools that our intelligence community has. And it boggles the mind of the American people to see that 3 years later, the intelligence community is finally coming around to where the American people were, about 3 years ago. Could you speak to, can you elaborate on how you developed your degree of confidence to the extent that you can? I realize there's information you cannot share. But.
Well, I've talked a little bit about it today, but I think, this highlights one of the comments that the Congresswoman from Michigan was making earlier about no one can know with certainty. I actually agree with that at this point in time, but we don't have to in making intelligence community assessments. We have to have some level of confidence. It can be low, it can be moderate, or it can be high. So I have been very clear that when we look at all of our intelligence, much of it is circumstantial. And with circumstantial evidence, you can never know with certainty. But that doesn't mean that you cannot make an assessment with some level of confidence. And the more I have learned about this and the more I have seen, and again, as the person who had more access to our intelligence for the first year, as much as anyone in our government, my level of confidence became higher. The things that others were supporting for a natural origins approach have fallen away, and some of the people that were promoting that have been revealed to have had conflicts of interest in perhaps promoting that as a theory. But again, I go back to the fact that at this point in time, 3.5 years later, no scientist in the world can point to anything from an environmental standpoint that ties COVID-19 to nature. On the other side of the equation, you have all of the things that we've talked about, China's obfuscation, and the fact that they have the best access to the intelligence that would be diagnostic and dispositive, and yet they have shared none of that with us. And if they had any that was indicative or diagnostic that this was naturally occurring, why wouldn't they share that? If there was no one to blame for this pandemic, why wouldn't they share that information? I think the answer is that they know certainly, or they either they don't know the answer or they don't want to know the answer because, like me, they know that the intelligence certainly points to lab leak as the most plausible assessment, the only one supported by intelligence, science, and common sense at this point.
Now, you developed this high degree of confidence. Could you speak about when? Was it earlier or later in the process?
When I became the Director of National Intelligence, I had seen the prior assessments. I had been a member of Congress on the intelligence community. I said, show me all of the intelligence that we have, and I was frankly surprised how little we had supporting natural origins, how much we had, circumstantial or otherwise, that supported the lab leak. And over time, again, some of the explanations for natural origins became less and less likely. Again, I was told that some of this would appear over a course of months. We've now been 3.5 years, and we haven't identified an intermediate host, a reservoir source or species, any of those things. So pretty rapidly, which is why I talked about the process that Mike Pompeo, Secretary Pompeo, and I went through to declassify some of this with the hope that the next administration would declassify more information while protecting our sources and methods, and that this body would hold hearings. Unfortunately, 2 years went by without any hearings in this body into the origins of COVID. So, I'm grateful that we're getting there, but these are things that should have taken place a long time ago.
Now, you've alluded that even as the DNI, you had trouble sometimes getting information from the intelligence community, and could you speak to that?
Well, I think there was at times reluctance, and as I've commented, that the independent analytic ombudsman found that there were instances where, particular to China, some intelligence was being suppressed so that it could not be used to support policies that the administration in which I was serving, the Trump administration, could use that, and that was improper, I think I've addressed that.
Yeah, that's, to me, that's one of our major concerns from an oversight perspective is looking into, an intelligence agency that seems to gone wayward in some of these aspects. And Dr. Lowenthal, while I certainly appreciate some of your comments, I think the intelligence community may have drifted since then, and so it's important that we look into this. I'm sorry, my time's up. Thank you, Chair.
I now recognize Dr. McCormick from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ratcliffe.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. As a former U.S. attorney, it was and still is my opinion that FISA is an important tool in the fight against international terrorism. I think it's estimated that 25% of our actionable intelligence on foreign terrorists comes from FISA authorities like Section 702, which isn't up for reauthorization. But my point is that properly used, reauthorization of certain FISA authorities should be non-controversial and should be bipartisan. The problem is that many of us, as has been pointed out, including those of us with access to classified information, have seen what appear to be egregious abuses and misuses of FISA authorities and corresponding misrepresentations before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court itself, specifically as it pertains to Obama administration DOJ and FBI officials in securing a FISA order on at least one U.S. citizen back in October of 2016 named Carter Page. Many of us do believe that the Obama Justice Department verified an unverifiable dossier that was funded by the Democratic Party to secure an order allowing for the surveillance of that former Trump campaign associate, Mr. Page. Many of us also believe that the Obama Justice Department had exculpatory evidence on the issue of probable cause that was not provided to the FISA court, at least not provided to the court during the pendency of the FISA order itself. Earlier this morning, the chairman said that he didn't see any evidence of FISA abuse as it pertains to Carter Page. You just heard Mr. Cohen say the same thing. Democrats generally have expressed that opinion. The former FBI director, former Director Comey, says the idea of FISA abuse is nonsense as it pertains to Carter Page. I and many of my colleagues disagree with that. I'll just leave it at the Inspector General has written a report, and we'll see who's right, and we'll see who's wrong. And I'm afraid, unfortunately, that the Inspector General is going to find that folks on my side of the aisle are right, that FISA procedures were abused and that they were not followed, and will offer recommendations to correct that. But again, we'll see. So I want to use my time to focus a little bit on process. And let me start out by just asking, do any special rules exist when submitting a FISA application to surveil or spy upon a political campaign or one of its associates? Anyone?
As I've stated earlier, we open cases based on specific and articulable facts that they're agents of foreign powers. I can't comment on anything outside the scope of the Freedom Act today.
Anyone? Special rules for surveilling a political campaign?
I'm not familiar with it, to be honest with you, sir. I can't say one way or the other.
Okay, so let's then use the existing framework that we know of. When the government is presenting a case with respect to a U.S. person like Carter Page, the FBI is required to verify to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court or FISC that evidence is verified, correct?
When we draft an application, we have a Woods file that contains supporting documents to back up the facts.
Does the Department of Justice, are they required to disclose to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court any exculpatory evidence? Is there, in criminal cases, we have what's called the Brady requirement to disclose exculpatory information. Does that something Brady-like apply before the FISA court?
Again, as I was saying earlier, it's not Brady because that's a principle in criminal law in that context. But yes, my understanding at least, and subject to getting back to you on this question, but I think the answer is yes, we do try to provide the full picture to the court when applying for a FISA warrant. So that means evidence both indicating that the person, that there is probable cause that the person is an agent of foreign power, and information that would suggest to the contrary.
Okay, so in the case of Carter Page, if all the court heard was the arguments of the government seeking the warrant, no counter arguments presented questioning the motivations of the funders of the Steele dossier, no cross-examination about the veracity of the dossier itself, or about the credibility of the dossier's author, Mr. Christopher Steele, what safeguards are there in the FISA process currently to make sure that those obligations are met? And what, as a practical matter, would prevent the appointment of an attorney ad litem to represent the interests of a target of a FISA application, provided you could meet the security clearance requirements, maybe by taking someone from the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division?
So if I answer your question, I guess your question is whether we should...
time has expired. The witness may answer the question.
Your question is whether we should have something like an amicus or something like that to represent the targets of FISA applications? Is that your question?
And to be able to probe the arguments that the government is making to take the extraordinary measure of surveilling a U.S. citizen.
Yeah. So I guess one thing I would say is we have to remember that FISA is really in the national security world the same thing as I'm sure you're familiar with as an ex-U.S. attorney with a Title III wiretap, which is really the same type of thing, and we don't have any amicus or any other participation in that context. And so I'm not sure why it would be necessary or appropriate to have an additional lawyer in this context. We do have ex parte proceedings in the ordinary course when we're doing wiretaps of a drug dealer or an organized crime figure, et cetera. I'm not sure I would see a need for having an amicus in the same situation when it's a spy or a terrorist.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Georgia,
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Ratcliffe, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the panelists for being here today. I was struck by the remarkable consistency between your comments about ISIS and the ISIS caliphate being badly damaged but not defeated. And General Keane, I want to start with you because you twice made the comment about when it comes to defeating ISIS, you've talked about the need to drive ISIS out of the footholds that they have in Syria, and I assume those footholds are being fueled by the desperation of the Syrian people with Assad in power that he's been able to maintain by using Iran and Hezbollah and the IRGC and Russia. So I guess my question is, when we talk about the Salafi jihadi movement and radical Islamist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, do you agree that, at least with respect to Syria, the greatest factor into whether or not it continues to exist or expand and contract is whether or not Assad is in charge in Syria?
Well, first of all, the ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which is a thriving organization in Syria, they're only there because there is a civil war there. And they were drawn to an area and they were able to establish safe zones and take advantage of the circumstances that are there. So they're absolutely feeding on that. Certainly Assad, a brutal dictator to be sure, the so-called Arab Spring arose and the people wanted to turn him out. And they were on their way to actually doing that when the Iranians and the Russians successfully intervened and stalemated the situation. And then the Russian military intervention and the Iranian plus-up really changed the entire momentum. Assad is not going anywhere now. I mean, we've got to be honest about it. They have successfully propped up this dictator. What's going on in Geneva is a fantasy. I mean, the Russians and the Iranians may change Assad out because they want another Alawite dictator. But their military intervention has succeeded in indefinitely keeping Assad or somebody like him in power. We have long since squandered the opportunities to do something about that.
And so do you think it is an overstatement then to say that the jihadi movement there through groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whatever else may come will continue as long as Assad reigns over Syria or someone just like Assad?
Yes, the opposition to Assad is not going to go away either because they are very committed. They want a secular, most of them a democratic state, some of it an Islamic state. So as long as that continues, that'll give radical Islamists opportunity. And that organization, we didn't talk about it here, but the Al-Qaeda organization, the son of al-Nusra that operates in Idlib province, is a very dangerous organization which clearly has objectives to operate outside the region in Europe and against the United States. So yes, this is a breeding ground for radical Islam.
So I guess that leads to what is an unpopular topic for a lot of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle when we talk about regime change. But it seems to me that our best option for addressing the threat of ISIS and al-Qaeda, and frankly the threat of, as you call it, a hegemonic threat from Iran, and its ability to propagate Hezbollah and groups like that, is a Syria without Assad. And you intimated a little bit about how we would accomplish that. And I know, the Free Syrian Army and arming those, and I've heard the arguments about, well, you're just arming terrorists. You made reference, though, to an Arab NATO earlier, and I'm wondering. I heard John Bolton recently talk about a regional Arab force in the area, and so my question, I guess, first question is: Are you talking about the same thing there?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say that I don't believe this administration has a coherent strategy to deal with this problem. And I know for a fact the previous administration certainly did not, and actually, I think, enabled the problem to get worse. And it is a complex problem, as Ambassador Crocker so accurately pointed out. And you can be on either side of this issue and be making what seems to be a very plausible argument, to be frank about it, because it is such a disturbing situation. But in my view, Syria is a strategic anchor for the Iranian hegemonic movement and their ability to encroach on Israel and move out of Syria. And it's also a melting pot for radical Islamists. So I think we should take an interest in what is happening there and try to push back on it. And yes, what I would do is try to control the eastern part of Syria, of the Euphrates River Valley, and I would bring the regional Arab nations in to help do some of that. That gets us back at the bargaining table. In other words, it gives us some political leverage. We're not going to go to Damascus with military force. We're not going to go into Syria with tens of thousands of U.S. forces. There's no political will to do anything quite like that. But there are ways that we can get into have some negotiating leverage if we have some skin in the game, as opposed to just walking away from it.
So you talk about political will, and my time's expired, but this is an important question. I want your perspective. I'd really like it from all of you, and hopefully some other panelists can follow up on it. But when you look at it from the other side of the ledger and political will, when we talk about this issue, do you think that Russia has enough invested that they would ever go to war over Syria?
Russia doesn't want to go to war over Syria, and Russia certainly doesn't want to go to war with the United States over Syria. And we don't need to be intimidated by Russia in Syria. And we long since permitted them to take advantage of us. Secretary Kerry told the Russians, because they were rolling into Syria, do not under any circumstance bomb the Syrian moderates who we were providing aid to by the Central Intelligence Agency. They had anti-tank missiles, and they were a formidable force as a result of that capability. First people the Russians bombed were the Syrian moderates with the anti-tank weapons. And what did we do about that? Nothing. We should have told them right then and there, you do that again, we're going to take down your airfield, and we're going to go after your proxy force on the ground, the Syrian regime. And my judgment, that would not have led to World War III. It would not have led to war with the Russians. They have a limited capability, have never been outside their region in 35 years. They had 30 to 40 airplanes. We dominate that area in terms of military power. They would have backed up. But we had no will. We lacked will.
I appreciate your insights, and I appreciate the Chairman's indulgence.